Hello, bonjour to the participants of the Quebec Worker Cooperative Summit 2019. Very glad that you're doing what you're doing and happy for the privilege to be with you for a few minutes.
We live at a time with daunting economic, social, and political challenges, including those touching migrant, indigenous, and climate justice. Do you think that workplace democracy can help us to address some of these challenges, and if so, how?
Well, there are some very obvious ways. So let's take one of the topics right at the top of discussion and debate right now in the United States. The world economy is being hit by a kind of a battering ram, Trump's wrecking ball, on the charge that China is behaving unfairly, cheating the United States. It's the main charge is China's taking away our jobs. That's the appeal to the American working class that Trump is basing his actions on. So let's take a look at it. China is taking away our jobs. Does China have a gun to the heads of the CEO of Apple, Microsoft, General Motors, saying you better send jobs here or else we'll blow your brains out? I haven't noticed that. Actually, the decisions seem to be made in the boardrooms in New York, Chicago, where the boards of directors and managers get together and say we can meet our responsibility to our shareholders by sending jobs to China. So if you want to concern yourself about sending jobs to China, the question that arises is who is entitled to make these decisions? If it's the board of directors, fine, they're doing their job, nothing to blame China about. You could argue that it could be a democratic decision made by the people of the enterprise, the workers of the enterprise. They could be making the decision as to where the enterprise should be. Maybe they would decide that we ought to give up our jobs and send them to China. It's possible. But they could make another decision. So they could make the decision that, look, this enterprise is profitable. It's maybe not enough to satisfy the bankers in New York who own the shares, but it's not our business. So let's just take over the enterprise and run it, and then we won't have to worry about China taking our jobs. It's a pretty simple argument. Strangely, one never hears it. I wonder why.
Okay. Barriers. What do you think are some barriers holding the worker cooperative movement from growing larger to help meet these challenges, and how might we tackle them?
I think the major, of course, there are plenty of institutional barriers. So if, for example, workers did decide that, yes, we ought to democratically run our enterprise, first thing would happen is the army would enter and kill them all and so on. So there are institutional barriers, but they can be overcome. The harder barrier, I think, is what Gramsci called hegemonic common sense. There are some ideas that just never come to mind. So let's take this little discussion we just had, 2 minutes, very simple argument. It's kind of trivial. Think about it for a minute. It's sort of obvious. Never comes to anybody's mind. Well, if things don't come to mind, you don't do anything about them. Actually, George Orwell had something interesting to say about this. In his book Animal Farm, which everybody's read, everybody knows, not too many of people have read the introduction to Animal Farm. The reason was it was suppressed. The introduction was addressed to the people of England. It came out, it was discovered many years later, 30 years later in his papers. It's now been published, but it didn't come out with a book. It was addressed to the people of England. It said, basically, look, this book is a satire about the totalitarian enemy, but the people of England shouldn't feel too self-righteous about it, because in England, I'm virtually quoting now, he said, in England, free England, ideas can be suppressed without the use of force. And he gave some examples and had a couple of sentences of explanation, which are pretty much to the point. He said, one reason is the press is owned by wealthy men who have every interest in not having certain ideas expressed. But the second reason, which I think is a more important one, is essentially a good education. If you've had a good education, you've gone to the right schools, you went to Oxford and Cambridge, you have instilled into you the understanding that there are certain things it just wouldn't do to say. And I think we can add it wouldn't do to think. Part of an education, being part of the culture, is just imbibing the understanding that you just don't, there are certain things that you can't even think about. It's like saying, it's like questioning the existence of the air you breathe. One of them is democratic control of the workplace. This has not always been true. You go back to the early Industrial Revolution, it was taken for granted by working people that, of course, they should run the enterprises. Take a look in the United States in the mid-19th century, beginning of the Industrial Revolution in eastern Massachusetts. It was a very lively, flourishing labor press written by working people themselves, many of them young women, what were called factory girls, kind of driven from the farms to work in the mills. A lot of big literature, and there's themes that run right through them. One of them is that wage labor is equivalent to slavery. The only difference is it's supposedly temporary. That was the main theme of the Knights of Labor, the major industrial organization that developed. Said those who work in the mills ought to own them and run them. It's obvious. This was so obvious that it was part of the hegemonic common sense of the day. It was a slogan of the Republican Party, for example. Abraham Lincoln accepted it. In fact, it has roots way back in classical liberalism, back to John Locke, Thomas Paine, that to take away, if a person, actually Wilhelm von Humboldt, the great humanist, one of the founders of classical liberalism, wrote that if an artisan produces a beautiful work on command, we may admire what he did, but we despise what he is, namely a tool in the hands of others, not a free human being. Well, that was taken for granted by working people. Some of them, you look at the labor press, there were arguments saying it might be that over time these ideas will be driven out of people's heads, but we hope that day will be long in coming. Well, it wasn't that long. There's massive efforts to make it seem that it's just natural and appropriate that you should spend most of your waking hours in a system that's more brutal and destructive than a totalitarian state. If you live in a totalitarian state, they don't tell you you're not allowed to go to the bathroom, okay, or you can't talk to this person, or you have to wear this kind of clothes and so on. That's where people spend their working lives, living under totalitarian rule in which you may admire what they do, but you despise what they are. I don't think this is much below the surface. I think this understanding of normal people, ordinary people at the early days of the imposition of industrial capitalism can easily be revived. If it is, you've overcome the major barriers.
Yeah. Okay. What do you think is the most significant worker co-op or worker co-op complex, and what can we learn from it?
Well, I suppose the most long-standing and best established one is Mondragon in the Basque Country, northern Spain. It's been in existence since the 1950s. It by now is a very extensive conglomerate, manufacturing, banking, housing, health services, worker-owned, to an extent worker-directed. It's been it's economically been quite successful. It withstood the Great Recession to an extent unusual among industrial conglomerates. It has problems. One problem is it exists within the overarching capitalist economy. So they have to raise questions about should we exploit third world labor for cheaper prices? It's the kind of question you have to ask. Actually, just if I can add a personal anecdote, I worked in a kibbutz back 65 years ago for a while, and that question came up as well. It was a cooperative, self-managed collective, pretty radical in those days. They've changed since. But it happened to be right next to what was called a ma'abara, a place where immigrants were brought in, huge number of immigrants from the Arab-speaking countries who were very poor, living in terrible conditions. And the question arose, should we give them work in the kibbutz? If we do, we're exploiting them, which is not fair. We don't believe in that. If we don't, they have nothing to do. What decision do we make? It's not easy, but trying to develop a free, just, democratic society within a larger, oppressive, brutal one based on hierarchy and domination is not easy. It's not easy intellectually. Now we're back to Gramsci's common sense, and it's not even easy practically. How do you deal with these questions that arise all the time? So I think if you look at the history of, say, Mondragon and other collectives, cooperatives, worker-owned enterprises, you find that these kinds of questions arise constantly.
Okay. What can we do to popularize the worker cooperative concept and get more people excited about it so that it can play a much greater role in the economy? Would you help?
Well, that's the kind of question that answers itself. You get out and agitate, try to explain how do we tell people that unless we get off fossil fuels, all of these questions will be moot. You have to meet people, talk to them, organize, educate, agitate, carry out actions that dramatize it. That's the way things happen. That's the way all progress has ever taken place, often from very small beginnings. Take, say, the women's movement, maybe one of the major achievements of the past half century or so. I began very small consciousness-raising group, a few people talking to each other, saying we don't have to accept these things. Blossomed, grew, had a major impact on life. And I think that's true with everything you look at. Abolitionism, civil rights movement, anti-war movement, all starts like this. And it's the same here. There aren't any magic tricks.
Worker co-op federations in North America are exploring the possibility of having the General Motors plants being shut down become worker-owned electric vehicle manufacturing co-ops. What do you think of this approach?
Well, that was a very concrete question that arose just about 10 years ago. And it was quite interesting to see the way it was dealt with. During the Great Recession in the United States, the automobile industry was pretty much nationalized. They didn't call it that, but it was collapsing. The only way it could be maintained was for the government to intervene and pretty much take it over. Now, there were various paths that could have been taken from that point. One of them, the one that was taken, was to bail it out, give it back to the former owners, maybe different faces, but essentially the same class, have them proceed to do exactly what they were doing before, namely building trucks and cars. That's what was done, without question, incidentally. There was another path, which would have been quite reasonable, but was discussed only way out at the margins. It was to hand it, since the government had essentially taken over the industry, hand it over to the workforce, let them think about, deliberate what they think ought to be done with it. Maybe what ought to be done is to do what the country really needs, which is not more cars and trucks, but efficient mass transportation. So you don't have to sit in a traffic jam 3 hours a day to get to work. Maybe they would have decided that. Maybe would have made other decisions. But that was certainly a possibility. It was never mentioned anywhere in polite society, only like I mentioned it, other people like that, but way out at the fringe. Well, we're back to common sense. Things that you just instilled into you that wouldn't do to say, even though they're very obvious. As soon as you say them, people can understand them. But the thing is, back to the earlier question, you have to say them so people can start thinking about them. Could have been done in 2008 if there had been a sufficient popular activist movement committed to it, would have changed the world a lot.
Indeed. The Green New Deal is increasingly popular in the U.S., especially among young people, and has recently spread formally to Canada. What place do you see economic democracy having in the Green New Deal? In general, what government policies might we seek to encourage the development of worker cooperatives?
Well, the rise of the Green New Deal actually bears directly on the questions you just raised. 2 years ago, there was no talk about a Green New Deal. What happened? A small group of young people, Sunrise Movement, began to act politically, organizing, educating, and got to the point where they were sitting in congressional offices. They happened to be supported by some of the very exciting younger people, all women, in fact, who've just been elected to Congress on the wave of popular activist movement. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was the main one who picked it up. The senior senator from Massachusetts, Ed Markey, has been interested in environmental issues, joined. All of a sudden, you had it on the legislative agenda. An enormous change, really initiated by a small group of young people. Of course, as soon as it was brought forth, a huge series of attacks and ridicule and ridiculous and so on, including things like what you just mentioned, that it was bringing up questions of democracy and participation and workers' rights and so on. Well, that's to be expected. When you challenge authority and privilege, they're not going to say thank you, okay, so that you take for granted. Well, the actual form of that was proposed is probably not workable in the form that it was presented, but it doesn't make any difference. I mean, some kind of Green New Deal is absolutely essential. Otherwise, organized human life is not going to survive. And in fact, there are very serious proposals detailed, careful, serious proposals. The one that's most worked out and most persuasive in my mind is by an economist, Robert Pollin, University of Massachusetts. There are other approaches, and it has to be constructed in such a way that it accounts for the fact that people are going to lose jobs and should get better jobs. There's many more jobs available in, putting solar panels on roofs than in coal mining. There's all kinds of opportunities for it, but who's going to make those decisions? Well, we're back to where we started. Those decisions ought to be made by the people whose lives are affected and whose lives will be changed. Now we're back to workers' democracy, so it should be right at the center of any effort to implement the Green New Deal.
Okay, and this is the last question. What advice would you have for us to build a strong, sustainable movement for workplace democracy?
I think the only advice I know is to do what the Sunrise Movement did, what the women's movement did in its earlier stages, what abolitionists did back from the 18th century. Just get out there and work. And I don't think these are impossible tasks. Everything we've been talking about, it seems to me, is you could easily explain to an elementary school student. It's not quantum physics. It's right on the surface. It's right there to be perceived. If you can tear away this veil that says there are certain things it wouldn't do to say or to think. And that's the job of activists and organizers. And I don't think it's an impossible one. It's been achieved many times in the past. It can be done this time too.